Those of you who watch my videos regularly are probably already aware that I see humanity's current evolutionary struggle mostly in terms of moving from a paradigm of addiction to one of wisdom. And so in this video, I'd like to explore what's making wisdom such an immense struggle for the human race. In past videos, I've suggested that part of the answer has to do with a kind of circular paradox woven into the whole issue of wisdom, and it goes something like this. It would take wisdom to realize that what we're lacking is wisdom. Basically, we're not wise enough to recognize that we're not wise enough. And that sort of circular trap makes it pretty difficult to move closer toward wisdom, which in turn only perpetuates and exacerbates our world's problems. However, in this video, I'd like to explore another variable in the equation, and it has to do with the relationship between wisdom and discomfort, with how cultivating wisdom tends to place uncomfortable demands upon us, which then contributes to the overall difficulty of actually attaining it. But before launching into all of that, I should probably provide a quick working definition of what wisdom actually is. Basically, wisdom consists of two interrelated capacities. First, it has to do with our ability to perceive what life is actually showing us, accurately and realistically. And then it has to do with our ability to respond to what we're perceiving harmoniously and constructively. And at this point, it's also important to note that that twofold ability is something very different from mental agility or intelligence. In that regard, it's entirely possible to be extremely intelligent, but also very unwise. And I don't think you have to look too far into the domain of politics to locate some pretty good examples of that. And on the other hand, it's entirely possible to be relatively unintelligent, but very wise. Maybe Forrest Gump would be a good illustration of that. And finally, I'd say that wisdom is holistic in character. It's about our ability to recognize, accept, and honor the wide terrain of life's reality, even the parts we wish weren't there. Anyhow, with those preliminaries out of the way, let's take up the main question of this video, which once again is, how does wisdom make uncomfortable demands on us, which in turn makes it a lot harder to start moving toward it? Of course, at the most general level, I'd say that wisdom involves discomfort because we hardly ever become wise while we're lounging easily in our safe spaces and comfort zones. Instead, wisdom is usually born in our shadows, in our contact with what's difficult and challenging, and what we usually deny and repress. It's born when life draws us toward the outermost boundaries that define who and what we are, and forces us to confront what scares us the most, our demons and our nightmares, when we have to live through something powerful enough to draw us beyond ourselves. Basically, the kinds of pivotal experiences that change our lives forever. And of course, all of that's hardly ever easy or comfortable. However, I'd say that a more specific answer has to do with the fact that, somewhat contrary to popular opinion, developing wisdom is mostly a subtractive process. In other words, it's not so much about adding new things to our lives, but about paring away the dead weight we're carrying. About letting go of what's debilitating us and distracting us from the luminous center of life. It's about learning to recognize things that may seem important in the moment, but that are inconsequential within the larger scheme of things. And then wisdom is about letting them fall away. Basically, it's about getting rid of the clutter in our lives, in our minds, and in our souls. As Gandhi once famously put it, renounce and enjoy. Or, as Thoreau articulated a similar sentiment a century before him, our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify, simplify. But the thing about renouncing and simplifying is that they aren't necessarily easy, especially when they're running against a lot of our culture's habits and values. For instance, I'd say that here in the United States, where I live, a lot of us think that life is mostly about trying to get what we want, and preferably more and more of what we want over time, which of course fuels a lot of our consumerism. And so the idea that an additive paradigm of endless accumulation might not be a very good answer to life's riddle can be a very uncomfortable thing to face. And so I'd say that the first reason why wisdom involves discomfort has to do with the necessity of sculpting away the things in our lives that, may seem seductive and pleasurable at first, but that ultimately just distract us from the task of living toward life's center. Basically, wisdom is demanding and uncomfortable because it involves letting go of our attachments. All of the relatively trivial desires that end up consuming our lives and enslaving us, and that ultimately make our existence a lot smaller than it really needs to be. But, of course, letting go of those sorts of attachments is hardly ever an easy sacrifice for any of us. And by the way, wisdom's subtractive nature is also part of why we tend to associate it with old age. Of course, the more obvious reason for that is that it usually takes a lot of time and a lot of experience to develop wisdom, especially since most of us have to traverse wide oceans of youthful imbecility before it even becomes marginally possible. However, another reason is that during old age, we eventually have to make our peace with the fact that we'll have less over time. Perhaps not so much in a financial or materialistic sense, but with regard to the much more personal realm of our physical and mental abilities, and that eventually that subtractive process will leave us with little more than the inner core of our humanity itself. And then we'll eventually lose even that, along with our lives themselves. And perhaps in the final analysis, that's the price of fulfilling our potential for wisdom. That devastating cost paid in the terrible currency of loss and death. A price dear enough and harrowing enough to jolt us out of our somnambulism. And because we don't really know how or when our final moments will happen, the time to move a little closer to wisdom is always now, not later in some imaginary tomorrow that may or may not arrive, but right now, even as you're watching this video. The unsettling fact is that our greater wisdom is always calling to us in each and every moment. And so the only real question is whether we'll be able to summon the courage to listen and then to learn to live accordingly, hopefully before we die. But of course, confronting all of that and facing the disturbing reality that every breath might be our last means learning to endure a fair measure of anxiety. And so I'd say that the second reason why wisdom usually involves discomfort has to do with recognizing the nature of our existential lot and how the cold and intimate caress of mortality is always passing over our skin, always carried in the winds that surround us. As the great sage Tyler Durden once expressed a very similar sentiment, it's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything. And I'd add that anything would also include laying claim to real wisdom. But Adopting that sort of attitude toward life and death only compounds wisdom's discomfort, especially insofar as it also means passing beyond a lot of our culture's prevailing habits and customs. And part of what makes that an uncomfortable process is that it means recognizing that our typical orientation to life is probably a lot less certain and a lot less adequate than we'd like it to be. And that contrary to what our world has told us, probably since childhood, no one knows what's really going on or even why we're doing what we're doing. Surprise. Basically, it means confronting the fact that no one really has the answers, least of all the people that claim to have them. Sure, we may have plenty of educated guesses and hopeful approximations, but not the answers. And that's an uncomfortable thing. First, because it means acknowledging how uncertain life really is. But also because it means passing beyond a lot of our world's socially sanctioned illusions. You know, all of our soothing, self-congratulatory fantasies about being in control of things. In other words, it means being willing to pass beyond our world's prevailing standards of normality and eventually becoming something anomalous. Becoming something anomalous in order to become ourselves. It means learning how to court other people's confusion and disappointment in order to move toward fulfilling our deeper destinies in this life. After all, a wise person is also an exceptional person. Someone who's not necessarily willing to live life as it's been preordained for us. And so I'd say that the third reason why wisdom involves discomfort is that it means becoming ourselves and learning not to spend all of our time slavishly conforming to other people's desires and expectations. Basically, wisdom is uncomfortable because it means we might have to stop behaving like other people's trained monkeys all the time. In other words, the wise life is also the deeply free and deeply responsible life. The kind of existence that has been liberated from a lot of the constraints that bind and hobble a pretty large fraction of our lives. Consequently, it's not about making excuses for ourselves or blaming other people for our problems, as is so common in our world these days. Instead, it's about taking the reins of our lives in our own hands and riding toward the outer horizon of what we can possibly be in this world. However, beyond all of that, wisdom also makes us uncomfortable because it calls us toward letting go of our addictions. And here, addictive behavior would naturally include things like ingesting drugs, both legal and illegal, to try to numb our pain and or enhance our pleasure. But it would also include more ubiquitous phenomena like being addicted to social media, or maybe to internet pornography, or maybe to the enticements of commodity and entertainment culture more generally. However, out of all of the addictive things that exist in our world, I'd say that our own self-importance is by far the most intoxicating and debilitating. As I sometimes like to say, our self-importance pretty much makes crystal meth look like chamomile tea. And because of that, getting past it is another thing that makes wisdom uncomfortable. That's because it means developing humility, basically the exact opposite of self-importance. It means recognizing that we're not God. And oh, the horrific tragedy of it all. The exquisite agony of that unforgettable and unforgivable moment of existential mutilation when we finally have to realize that we're not actually the center of everything, and that all of our childish fantasies of omnipotence are dissolving away in the inexorable tide of life's larger reality. Oh, the freaking humanity of it! Well, I guess that on the other hand, as Voltaire once suggested, the perfect might actually be the enemy of the good. And so wisdom might involve learning to favor the good over the perfect. Anyhow, if you don't believe that wisdom means letting go of self-importance and developing humility, well, ask yourself how often wise people seem arrogant and obnoxious, and how often they seem humble and self-effacing. And while I'd agree that in theory wisdom can take any form, I'd also say that in practice the ratio is definitely skewed toward humility. And so I'd say that the fourth reason why wisdom makes us uncomfortable is that it involves letting go of our addictions, and most especially our addiction to our own self-importance. And then learning to move through life with an abiding sense of humility rather than arrogance. And at this point, it'd be good to ask about what letting go of our addictions and our addictive habits would entail. Well, we've already said that it would first mean letting go of our attachments and the various ways that we cling to what we want, which would mean learning to be faithful to what life is actually asking us to experience. However, another uncomfortable part of the process has to do with the fact that at some point, our decisions have to become real. And that may seem a little bit odd, so let me explain. Part of the problem with living according to the paradigm of addiction is that our dependencies basically end up making our decisions for us. Of course, that's not what we typically tell ourselves when we're in addiction's thrall. What we tell ourselves is that we have things pretty much under control and that we can quit whenever we want, that we're just enjoying ourselves and or that we just need X, Y, and Z just to get by. Basically, all of the lies, excuses, and self-deceptions that appear on the very first page of Addictions 101. But the deeper reality is that our addictive habits are probably making most of our decisions for us. Decisions about how we spend our money, our energy, and our time, who we think of as our friends and partners, where we end up going, and what we end up doing. And when the terrible day arrives when we finally have to admit to ourselves that we really do have a problem, and that we should probably do something about it, well, that kind of honesty is not an easy thing, especially when we're used to lying to ourselves and to everyone else too. So I'd say that the fifth reason why wisdom makes us uncomfortable is that it demands an extraordinary degree of honesty. Enough honesty so that our decisions can become something substantive and real, and not just another flimsy theatrical charade aimed at deceiving ourselves and the people around us. Boom. In other words, a part of the discomfort has to do with learning the meaning of commitment. And that's a big reason why addicts' decisions aren't reliable and why their speech is usually littered with all sorts of fairly obvious lies and deceptions. It's because there's not much sense of commitment undergirding all of that. And here I should probably mention a fairly common fallacy about the nature of commitment, especially since it helps explain why it's so easy to think that we're committed to something when in reality we're many miles from it. And at this point, I need to give props and credit to this little book by Richard Knowles, which is about exploring the work of the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson in light of Martin Heidegger's phenomenological ontology. Bit of a mouthful. Anyhow, the upshot is that while common opinion would hold that to be committed to something is to be both wholehearted about it and fully sure of ourselves, in reality, that's nothing more than the grandiose logic of the zealot. Someone who's deluded himself into thinking that he somehow escaped all of the ambiguity and uncertainty inherent to human existence and can consequently now see everything in terms of godlike absolutes. Woohoo! But in reality, commitment isn't about wallowing in that sort of inane pretentiousness. It's about striking a somewhat paradoxical balance between being only partially sure of ourselves, but still wholehearted. But why is that? Well, the reason is that to be substantive, our commitments have to be grounded in reality and not just a figment of our fantasies and wishful thinking. And the overarching reality of human existence is that we can always be wrong. Errare humanum est, as we used to say in the Latin of my youth. To err is human. And as a consequence, genuine commitment isn't about being unswervingly rigid, as popular opinion might have it. It's not about adamantly refusing to change our minds, even when the reality of the situation obviously warrants it. Instead, commitment is about being faithful to what life is showing us and what we're experiencing, and about adapting our posture toward it when necessary. But, of course, that requires a lot more discernment than simply being rigid does. In other words, the reason why our commitments often turn out to be nothing but fanciful illusions is that they're not resting on an accurate appraisal of reality in the first place. And so we tell ourselves that this time we're really going to change our addictive habits. This time we're really going to lose weight, or give up smoking, or quit watching internet porno. But it almost always ends up being just another great big nothing burger. It's because our overinflated bluster and self-certainty isn't congruent with the nature of genuine commitment in the first place, which then turns our so-called commitments into little more than ephemeral fantasies and theatrical displays. Basically, as the great 20th century sage Harry Callahan once put it, a man's got to know his limitations. Punk. It's probably the worst impression in history. And by the way, so does a woman. And genuine commitment is based upon a canny, realistic appraisal of those limitations. But here again, that's not necessarily an easy or comfortable thing. Mostly because there are very few things in this world more uncomfortable than having to recognize our limits and to realize, once again, that we're not God. And so I'd say that the sixth reason why wisdom involves discomfort has to do with learning the real meaning of commitment and consequently recognizing our human limitations, which is almost always an uncomfortable process. Okay, so there they are. 6, count them all, collect them all, trade them with friends, one in a series, 6 reasons why developing wisdom involves discomfort, which in turn makes it difficult to move toward it. So let's summarize. Reason 1, developing wisdom is mostly a subtractive process that involves sculpting away the things in our lives that distract us from the task of living toward life's center, which in turn runs against the grain of a lot of our world's values. Reason 2, developing wisdom involves becoming realistically aware of our existential lot in life, which for most of us means learning to endure a certain measure of anxiety, especially in the face of our mortality. Reason 3, developing wisdom means becoming ourselves and learning not to spend all of our time slavishly conforming to other people's desires and expectations. In essence, the wise life is also the deeply free and deeply responsible life. Reason 4, developing wisdom means letting go of our addictions, and most especially our addiction to our own self-importance, and then learning to move through life with humility rather than arrogance. Where are we? Are we up to 4? 5. Reason 5. Developing wisdom demands an extraordinary degree of honesty, enough so that our decisions can become substantive and real. And finally, reason 6. Developing wisdom means learning the meaning of genuine commitment, and consequently recognizing our human limitations, which is almost always an uncomfortable process. Of course, that's far from a comprehensive list, but hey, it's a start. However, it still leaves open the question of how we might begin to learn to deal with those sorts of challenges on a more practical, everyday level. But this video is probably already long enough, so I guess I'll save that topic for later. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, especially since this video is a little longer than usual. So, congratulations if you made it all the way to the end, I guess. Achievement unlocked. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.